Let's start out by talking a little bit about military vehicles in general, specifically ground-based vehicles, talk a little bit about how they differ from other kinds of vehicles, and kind of take a look at some of the main visual elements that are involved in those vehicles and how we can use reference. So when we're working with military vehicles, it's always good to look at reference. Even if you're working with something that's a little futuristic, like we're going to be working on, it's good to look at current military vehicles just to get some idea and be able to ground it. And so there are a lot of uses for military vehicles in CG. In film, you've got military vehicles that you need to involve in explosions, and if it's more of a futuristic thing, then it's something that doesn't even exist. And so those are going to typically, if they're going to be up close on screen, a hero vehicle, you're going to have very high resolution, lots of model detail, even coming in and modeling the netting and the bolts and things like that on this particular vehicle. In something like video games, it's going to be, you're going to have a lot of military vehicles involved in those types of games. Those are going to typically be a little bit more low resolution. You can do a little bit more with texturing and so forth. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the elements involved in actual military vehicles. And I have friends that know basically everything there is to know about military vehicles, and so you may be that person. I am not that person, but I can talk about the modeling aspects of building some of these different vehicles, and these are going to be kind of all over the board as far as nationality and who uses these vehicles. But you can see that you've got on these military vehicles very sharp lines initially. So in something that like a car where you'd have a very smooth fender, you've got very faceted pieces on this. And so you can see it's very, just the shape itself is a very boxy shape. Okay, coming in here and looking at some of those things, still using typical wheels and tires, and we'll kind of change that up for our model a little bit to give it a little bit more of a futuristic feel. But you can see even this, a lot of the things that might have been a little bit more futuristic are now currently being used. Okay, things like this where it almost looks like a low resolution model. If you think of like a box model, it almost already looks like that because you've got very sharp lines here. And then, this exists on one plane right here. You got another plane here with things, kind of doors cut out of it. But you can see the wheel well. It's very faceted. Looks like an unsmoothed model. But you've got a lot of details here. A lot of these details are external. So you've got bolts that are sticking onto the surface. You've got a lot of things that are stuck onto the surface. Not a lot of smooth contours that are involved in this. It's very utilitarian, and that's kind of the look that we are going to be going for. You can see there's elements that are added on, softer surfaces that are added onto the back and so forth. And in this, even this, it almost looks a little bit fake. It looks like a low resolution model maybe. It doesn't look possibly as finished as we might. It's very utilitarian. So coming in and looking at all of these angles, you can see that we have a lot of detail, a lot of interconnecting angles. There just aren't a lot of smooth, curved surfaces there. Okay, and this is kind of typical of today's military vehicles. If you're doing something that is more designed, then obviously what you do is going to be a little bit different. And we can go through some of these. And so you can start to see a lot of very similar visual elements. This faceted look, this external detail that's on here. Okay, very utilitarian. Okay, based on what this vehicle needs to actually do versus how it actually looks. Okay, now we can also get into designs that are a little bit more futuristic, something that is not used in real life, let's say, but something that's designed for a film. You can see the Batmobile incorporates a lot of these faceted elements to create was a very interesting shape. Okay, so it's kind of a very aggressive, angular shape, but it still has all of those facets, which you could also almost say look like, again, that low polygon model, but it incorporates a lot of detail in here to create that effect. Okay, again, here's another example, very boxy shape, okay, with a lot of external detail, very utilitarian. Looking at the angles, you can see that we've got some detail along the side. We start to think about, okay, how much of this detail can I actually model versus how much should I incorporate into textures? Thinking about your whatever your goal is, if you're going to have this be very close to screen. So if it's going to be kind of a hero vehicle, then you're going to want to probably model a lot more detail. If it's going to be something for a game, you can incorporate a lot of that into the texturing. Okay, and we've got kind of a grandfather of this type of vehicle, APC from Aliens. You can see it's very faceted, and you've got the kind of window up here and the turret, gun turret on the top. It's very low to the ground, and so there's a lot to like about this particular design. And again, it's still very faceted with a lot of those angles that are cut across and so forth, and make a very interesting shape. Now, looking at reference is good, but if you're modeling your own vehicle, it'll be easier if you have a design to work from. And so for us, we're going to be using this design, and this is actually from one of our courses. This is from creating a concept vehicle in Photoshop from a 3D sketch. So Eddie takes you through the whole process of drawing this if you want to go through that. But this is the sort of the concept that we're going to use. So let's take a look at some of the elements here and talk about what happens when we have reference like this. So we have a nice perspective drawing, one image of this. And so we can take a look at some of the elements. You can see we have some interesting hubless wheels that we're going to be using. We've got the doors on the side. We've got kind of a ram on the front. Very angular. It's taken a lot of those elements that we saw in some of those real military vehicles and incorporated those along with some of the sci-fi kind of elements here. We've got the turret up on the top and so forth. So as we start to look at this as a modeler, we start to break it down into the pieces, how we can start to build some of these pieces together, how this works together. And so one of the things that we need to do is to actually fill in the gaps. So if we assume that this is symmetrical, then we've got all of the detail we need for both sides. Okay, so we don't actually see the other side, but we know that it probably looks like this side. If we want to make it asymmetrical, we could have a door just on one side for the troops and maybe have something else on the other side. But let's assume that's going to be symmetrical. It looks pretty symmetrical. So the only thing that we're really missing is the back. And so in that case, we have to start to think about some of the elements that are already on this piece and maybe incorporate things that match up with that design in the back if we only have the one drawing. Now, another thing to be aware of, if we're only using one drawing, you can get into trouble. For instance, just looking at this drawing, if we take a look at this door, we can kind of in our mind assume that this door, the middle of this door, is maybe halfway between the front of this wheel and the back of this wheel. So we think about this as kind of halfway. All right, now we see this line here, and we start to see this flat spot, and we can, our minds start to say, okay, well, this should be right on top of this door. And looking at this, it sort of looks like this line goes straight up, okay, along the vehicle. Now, if that goes straight up, then this connects right in. Then this is not really going to work in a 3D model. We take a look at this. There's not enough room in here to get this over halfway. So we've got this distance, which should be equal to this distance. Okay, and even if it's not, there's not enough room for this door to be the same size as this door. So we're getting a little bit of confusion here as we start to look at this single model. So it's good if we can start to get multiple views if we're working with artwork that we're trying to match. So in this case, we have a side view to work with as well, which actually came after our perspective view. But this clears things up a lot. So something that from looking at this I actually thought was straight up and down actually angles back quite a bit. So this line here, which appeared to me to go right up to the middle, okay, like this, that line actually extends back towards the turret, and that makes a lot more sense because this point is much further forward than this point back here. So our model starts to make sense once we get multiple views. And it's just the same kind of thing where we're working in Maya, we're working with multiple views. It just helps us to clarify things that that may be unclear in a 2D drawing, and we start to build it in 3D and it doesn't really match up. And so we can use multiple views to clarify some of those issues that are a little bit different. Now, there are also compromises that we may have to make. So you can see in these two views, one thing that is a bit different is the turret. So in this view, the guns only come to maybe right about here, whereas in this perspective drawing, the guns are much bigger. So it looks like they come up to maybe right about this point. If we say that this object and this object are the same. And so in those cases, we just have to compromise a little bit. Now, a lot of artists like to use image planes. A lot of artists don't like to use image planes. It just depends on the way you like to work. And you can see that we have a side view loaded up as an image plane, and this will just give you an idea of where everything's located. I think it's a good starting point, but you can't become a slave to the images, because oftentimes the images are not going to match. Things aren't going to work exactly as have been planned in 2D in 3D. So we'll have to make a few little modifications and changes as we go through this process, but it is a good way to block in some of the different pieces. Okay, and so you can see here the goal for us is to come up with this. And so you can see we have the different pieces, and one of the things that we have on these pieces are bevels. If we take a look at those, if you look at those real world models, or real world vehicles rather, even though they have those sharp facets, they're not going to be completely sharp. And so you always want to add that little bit of a bevel to those sharp edges, even if you've got something very faceted. All right, we've got the hubless wheels, we've got the ram on there, the turret, and so this is what we're going to be going for. You can see it corresponds basically to the image plane, but there are differences, and we'll talk about those as we go through the process. All right, so that's a quick look at just the basics of taking into account a reference, military vehicles in general, and kind of working with images, working with our artwork that we're going to be using. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about are some different ways that we can start to initially block in some of the geometry for our vehicles, whether it's a box modeling or more of an edge-based approach, and whether to keep some of the pieces as one piece versus multiple pieces. We can talk about that too. So we'll go ahead and do that next.